My name is Dwight Hutchison, and I'm the author of several books and articles about the Star of Bethlehem. And this is the 9th video in a series of videos about the star. And today we're going to be changing subjects a little bit. The previous videos were about the star that was seen while the Magi were in the east, while they were still in their homeland, and they had seen that there were a number of kingly signs, heavenly royal signs that were taking place in the heavens, and a whole series of them, in fact. and at a certain point they decided to go to Judea to look for this Messianic king. They came to the conclusion that the message of the star was about a Jewish Messiah king. And over a period of time, probably a couple of months, they made the great journey up the Euphrates Valley. And they reached a certain point, and then they started to cross over the Syrian desert to a place that we call Palmyra today. At that time it was Tadmur. And then they went on to Damascus. And after that they came across the Golan Heights there as they passed Mount Hermon on the right. And they arrived beside the Sea of Galilee, went down the Jordan Valley, then up from Jericho to Jerusalem. And during all that time, they were making the vast majority of this trip on horseback, I think, not on camels. Camels were usually used for moving goods. But they're doing this on horseback for several weeks, probably a couple of months. And they arrive in Jerusalem, and they've done all of this more or less in the daytime. Anyway, they arrive in Jerusalem, and there they make this great statement. They say, "Where is he, the one who has been born King of the Jews? Because we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him, to adore him, and to bow down before him, give him our allegiance." Now, for centuries, Christians have commonly thought that the Magi had the star going ahead of them visually all the way from the east to Jerusalem and then on to Bethlehem. And I came to the conclusion several years ago that this is not the case, that the star went on ahead of them, but not in a visual manner. They weren't watching it as they made the journey, either from the east or from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Now, thinking that the star did not go before them in a visual manner may seem pretty radical to some, but it's actually right there in the text. And we should pay more attention to the text and not less. In the text it says that they, while they were in the east, they saw the star. The star gave its message, and at a certain point they decided to go to Judea, having come to the conclusion that the star was referring to the Jewish Messiah. And so this star was a messenger, and they were never looking to it to give them guidance about how to get anywhere at any moment. So again, the star goes on before, it arrives and it stands over the place where that the child was. Now, it is at the point where that it is standing over the place where the child was that the wise men see it and rejoice. The text does not indicate that the men were visually following the star all the way from the east or even from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, but rather that the star went on before them from the east. It says, and when it had arrived, it stood over the place where the child was. And it was at that point when it was actually standing over the place where the child was that the wise men saw the star again. Now, they saw the star in particular circumstances, and we're going to talk about that in the next video, in video number 10, exactly what it was that they saw and why that they rejoiced. But today I just wanted to explore this just a little bit further. And you can go back into church history and see that the early church fathers thought that the wise men followed the star visually all the way from the east, all the way to Jerusalem, and then on to Bethlehem. But actually you don't have to take that perspective on things, because in Matthew's Gospel, where the story of the star is located, there are other stories that speak about people going on ahead of someone else, and they don't go on ahead of them visually. And so if you go to Matthew 26, Jesus is speaking there, and he tells the disciples just before his death and resurrection that after he is raised from the dead, he will go on before them to Galilee, and there that they will find him. Okay, and then this same wording is repeated by an angel that appeared after the resurrection of Jesus, and he told the people that were there, he said, he is going on before you to Galilee, and there you will find him. And in both of these cases, the word that is used there is the word proago, which is the word to go on before or to precede someone. And so Jesus did precede the disciples to Galilee after his death and resurrection, exactly like he said, and he saw them there again in Galilee. And in another incident in Matthew 14, we see how that Jesus sends the disciples on ahead of him across the lake, and it again is the word proago, and Jesus does this while he is sending away the group of people that are there, and he had just fed the 5,000, and then he proceeds to send them away, but he sends the disciples on ahead of him to the other side of the lake. And we read then that Jesus sends the crowd away, and then he goes up on to a hill to pray there. And after that, he goes down and he's on the lake, and it's already nighttime, and he's not able to see the disciples at any point, I think, during this whole time. Maybe he could, I don't know, but he has already sent them on ahead of him to precede him to the other side. But he later meets them on the lake. Yeah. So in that situation, Jesus is not looking to them for direction. He goes across the lake and he meets them there on the lake. So there are three examples from Matthew's Gospel of how that people or a person can go on ahead of others, can precede them to a different location. And that is what I think happened with the star. The star which they had seen while that they were in the east preceded them to Bethlehem. And it was there waiting for them when they arrived there. They were not watching the star as they were making their journey from the east or even from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Rather, the star had gone on ahead of them in a way of speaking, and it was waiting for them when that they got there. And remember what the text says. The star went on ahead of them. The star, having arrived, it stood over the place where the child was. So it was in position over the place where the child was when the wise men arrived. And as I have said throughout this series, the star was there to give a message. It was telling them that a great king had arrived. The star was never there to guide them to a certain house. So when they had arrived in Bethlehem, and during the night there, at some point, they come to understand that the star is again in a symbolic situation. It is there giving another message, if you like. But those men would not have been looking for the star to give any other messages at all, because they received the message, the main message, while that they were in the east. And so in this situation, I'll talk about specifically what the star was doing in the next video. But basically, when that they saw it again in Bethlehem, it was there affirming that the child was really in the town, because it was doing something very similar to what it had done before. And I think that this thing could have slipped up on them because, as I said, they weren't looking for any more messages. Now, for some of you who still want to hang on to the idea that the star gave a message and also guided people, I would like to just explore this a little bit in detail with you. Let's say that the star was only guiding the wise men from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And that is the position of a whole lot of people these days. The historic position of the church has been that the men followed the star visually from the east. And sometimes the word proago has a sense of being, of leading someone. In the book of Acts, one finds that the verb is used in several situations to talk about people being led out in front of judicial authorities. Yeah, and it's in a very specific context there. It's not just generally leading people. There in the book of Acts, at least, the people are being led out in front of judicial authorities. And so it's a very specific context where it's talking about leading someone. But in Matthew's Gospel, as we said, there are other situations, and the verb is different, and it actually means to precede, to go on ahead of someone. Now, going back again to their situation, they went to see Herod in a secret meeting. Now, the men have come from Babylonia, according to the theory that I proposed. And these men were probably accompanied by a security team. 3 or 4, 5, 6 men there as guards. And we don't actually know how many wise men that there were. So there might have been 3, 4, 5. Could have even been 6 or more. Yeah. So anyway, the text does not actually say that there were 3. And they probably had some servants as well, because these men had means. They were going to offer the baby Jesus some very significant gifts. And so they had means. They were wealthy men. They were probably not aristocratic as such. And I certainly don't think that they were kings. And we talked about this in another video. But they go and see Herod in the evening, most likely, under the cover of darkness. But it could have happened during the daytime. And so they have maybe some of their guards with them when they make the trip to the palace, and they're probably in a hotel not far from the palace. The palace was in the upper city of Jerusalem, and the good neighborhood, if one likes, was also up in the upper city area. So they probably didn't have very far to go when that they went to the palace. Now, they had these gifts. It's possible that they would have taken the gifts with them to the palace. I don't think it's probably likely, but maybe they did. Maybe they could have had the idea that the young Messiah was there at the palace. But you see what I'm talking about? I just don't think that they believed that this was the case. So they go to the palace, and they have the time there with Herod, and from that time with Herod, we know that the wise men thought that the star had appeared in the 2 years previous to their interview with the king. And so then they leave the palace, and again, that could have been during the daytime. They could have used the back door and not to be seen by others. Or it was during the evening, under the cover of darkness, that they went to the palace and that they came back to their hotel, because they have horses and they have equipment. They have their belongings that are there at the hotel, and they're not going to take all of that to the palace. So a lot of people have the idea that the wise men kind of come out of the palace and wow, they see the star, and it's in that context that they go on to Bethlehem following the star in a visual manner. And I just don't think that that is the case at all. Now, think about just what I told you. The belongings that belong to the whole team, the wise men, the security people, and their servants are all back at the hotel. And also their horses, and as I've said previously in another video, they were probably riding horses. Camels were generally used for transporting goods. And so these men have to go back to the hotel. So seeing the star immediately upon getting out of the palace does pose some problems, because they got to get back to the hotel, and if they're supposedly going to follow this star, they have to know that they're supposed to follow it, which I think is a bit doubtful. And I've explored this elsewhere, but you know, you have to have an idea that you have to follow something in order to follow it. Okay, and so I just don't think that is their situation. But let's assume, as everyone does, that they knew that they were supposed to follow it. Well, they got to go back to the hotel. They got to get their stuff together, and it's probably nighttime. I assure you, because to see stars, generally you have to see them during the night. So they're doing all this at night, you know, and they're kind of getting up the staff there, and they're getting their horses, and then they get down to the gate, and and the star is there in their street or something, because that's something that's never been really clear to me. If they're walking through city streets, it is very difficult to see any stars at all except the ones that are straight overhead. And then how are you going to have the idea that you need to follow it anywhere? It's above you. But let's assume that somehow that the star has guided them, or that they just know that they have to go to the gate, and that the star will be waiting for them. But there at the gate, there's a problem. In the ancient world, city gates were usually closed at night because there were marauders, robbers that could enter the city and leave through the gate as well. And it's just not a good idea for security purposes to leave the gates open. And there would have been a security detail, a group of soldiers that were there guarding the gate. And you know, and actually this gate is very near the palace where Herod lives as well. And so you can imagine as well that it's kind of a high security location. Just because right above this gate there are 3 major towers that Herod had built that are quite tall, actually. And the gate that leads to the area going to Bethlehem is just there beside those great fortified towers. And so the fellows have got to negotiate getting out. And I think we should really think about the position of those guards. They said, well, you're wanting to go to Bethlehem. You know, it's just 8 kilometers down the road, you know, about 5 miles. Why do you want to go to Bethlehem at night? There may be robbers on the road, you know. You don't go out there, you know. And besides, we have orders to keep this gate shut. So we're not going to open it for you. Go back to the hotel, get some sleep, and go tomorrow. And so this is probably their attitude toward anyone that comes to the gate during the night and wants to go to Bethlehem or anywhere. They're not going to open the gate. But then let's just assume, to make everyone happy, that they've gotten through this gate and that the star is there leading them, just guiding them the way that they should go. And yet there's another problem. They've gotten outside the city walls, and if the moon isn't shining pretty strongly, it becomes quite difficult to see where that one is going. And now horses are able to see a lot better than people. So a horse could find a path, if you want, but the horse doesn't know that it's supposed to follow a star, and yet the wise men have got to guide the horse following the star, you see. And so there's a problem as well. And then the star is going on ahead of them, and it gets down to Bethlehem. They go all this way, okay, stumbling along in one way or the other, and we're just assuming that there's some light on their path. Maybe the star is giving light on their path, but that's an assumption. It's not written in the text that way. And then they get on down to Bethlehem, and they're going through streets, and they're supposed to follow this star. And this is the star, the same star that they saw while they were in the east. Now, if that star had anything to do with their ancient wisdom, with their understanding of the heavens, with symbols in the heavens, with real stars, a star that gives a message that is culturally understandable, then how is it that it is there in the street with the men, kind of guiding them so that they get to a house? And I'll also indicate this. Well, maybe if it's not in the street, it's just a bit higher up, and maybe it's 100 yards away. Well, actually, there's another problem that exists. If it's 100 yards or 200 yards away, and it's generally in the direction of Bethlehem, then the star is going to be going over a whole lot of houses, okay, all during the trip, and certainly one could think that it could arrive over a certain house and there stop, and then the men would know that that was the house. But when did they know that the star was going to guide them to a particular house? When did they know that the star was going to guide them to Bethlehem? Why did they need the star to guide them to Bethlehem? And once they arrive at the house, because it is at a house, specifically in the text, where that they do arrive while the star is standing over the house, standing over the town, in my opinion, then there's another problem. Are you going to knock on the door in the middle of the night, like we see in the movies? Well, actually, probably not. It wouldn't be very polite. And Joseph probably would not be inclined to open the door. He has in his house the Messiah of Israel, the one who is destined to reign over all the nations. And he has the charge of taking care of this child until that child comes into his role of authority. And so it's not reasonable for him to open the door to anyone at any moment during the night. And besides, he does not recognize the voice or the voices of these men. And they probably have a foreign accent, even if they spoke Aramaic. So he has a lot of doubts that will arise in his head, and he will probably refuse to open the door. And it's possible that these men, having had their servants load up the horses, and maybe they had a camel or two carrying goods with them, carrying their equipment and things like that, extra clothes, etc., etc. It's possible that they've gone through this entire process during the night, and they've gotten through the gate, and then they get down to Bethlehem, and there they're going to just sit at the door and until dawn. You see what I'm talking about? Some of these things are a bit weird and a bit wild, and I think that people just really don't think it through. But myself, I believe that the star did precede them from the east. They arrived in Judea, and they were never looking at the star for guidance. The star was up there in the sky most every night, and visible. Maybe there would be some clouds, but usually it would be visible at some point during the night. And if you actually look at my books, I have described this because the star for the months preceding the arrival of the wise men, after the star rose at the end of August of 2 BC, it was in the eastern sky for a good while, and then over a period of time, it found itself higher and higher and higher. And so by the time that the wise men arrived in Judea, and by the time that they arrived in Bethlehem, for a large portion of the night, the star was very high in the heavens over the place where that the child was, for a large portion of the night. And in the next video, we will be exploring how that this star was positioned, and exactly how that it was symbolically present over all of Judea and over the place where that the child was. And we'll get into that in the next video.